So I chose this picture of a child sleeping against the background of the stars. So up until about 60 years ago, before electrification of our homes became common, a child would be sleeping in a natural environment, just as we have been since the Stone Age, really. Then we added mains electricity fields to our houses, and possibly some artificial chemicals and so on. But then in the last decade, all of a sudden, there's this whole mass of transmitting technology using weak pulsing microwaves. So instead of this picture, it's more like this picture here. If you can't see it, it's a family surrounded by sources of wireless radiation. I'm sure you've noticed it. You know, you'll go into an environment, go into a pub, cordless-phone on the bar, there's a Wi-Fi router, there's people using their devices. So it's this huge change. I not only discovered I wasn't the only person reporting symptoms, but there is a research team in France run by Professor Belpom, who are really opening our eyes, because they are exploding this myth that the symptoms are all in the mind. Professor Belpom and his team have seen over 1,000 people coming to their clinic in Paris, adults or parents with children who are struggling with self-reported symptoms. And he did physical tests, and in the physical tests he found when they were exposed to the wireless radiation, there was a dramatic drop in the blood flow in their brain. And he also found chemical markers in the blood. So we're beginning to see that these electrosensitivity symptoms do have some sort of physical underpinning. And in a way, I used to do lots of work on climate change, I still do. It reminds me so much of back in the 80s and 90s, before climate change was taken on board. The papers were building up, the research papers were building up, but it was still being resisted. And it reminds me of tobacco. The research papers were building up, but the idea that there was a problem with tobacco was still resisted. Next picture, please. Oh well, I know we all did this at school, but it's worth a quick glance again. Here's the electromagnetic spectrum, heavily simplified. On your left here, as the electric pylon, you have your long wavelengths, and as you go towards the end, where you can see X-rays and gamma rays, radioactivity, you have short wavelengths and very, very fast oscillations, the oscillations of the frequency. So long to short, slower to faster. And over the millennia, the electromagnetic radiation that we've evolved with is, of course, from the beautiful sun. So that's in the centre here. So we've evolved these lovely eyes to perceive the radiation. We've evolved ways of using it, so plants photosynthesize, we make vitamin D. We've developed pigments to help protect us from the radiation, so we develop a tan. But even with those millennia of adaptation, the electromagnetic radiation from the sun still carries risks. It photoages our skin, and there are risks for skin cancer. So what about these big sources of artificial electromagnetic radiation that we've added to our world? Well, X-rays are brief. We don't want to be overexposed to them. It's ionized chemical bonds, it can damage DNA. Gamma rays, well, say no more, they're very powerful. They have to be careful with radioactivity. We know that. It's only in recent years we're beginning to understand that the non-ionising radiation seems to have hazards too. It's not the sudden dramatic effects, it's more subtle ones. So in 2002, the World Health Organization decided that the ELF frequencies, or ELF, I know I'm going to be teased about this afterwards, if we're overexposed, they do carry health dangers, and they decided that they are a possible human carcinogen. And this was based quite a lot on studies of childhood leukemia in families living near the big pylons. In May 2011, the World Health Organization, or at least its classification body, looked at depths of research. It wasn't just mobile phones and brain tumours, the ones that we've all heard about. It was also animal studies, and they decided that the weak pulsing microwaves and the wireless technology are also a possible human carcinogen. There are precautionary scientists saying that this classification is too weak. For example, Professor Leonard Hardell and his research group, this year they've been arguing that this type of radiation should be a class 1. That's the highest classification. However, their results are sort of conveniently pushed to one side in a recent review. So, it's going to take time, unfortunately, for the precautionary science to be taken on board. I remember thinking, well, hang on a moment, we've all had radios and TVs, we've not had any problems with those. And then, as I began to research, I realised that actually the big broadcasting towers, from which our radio and TV signals emanate, they have given us clues. It's just that somehow, as a society, we've missed them, we've missed the clues. So, for example, again, childhood leukemia, there's about 8 studies, including Park 2004, found higher childhood leukemia rates around these big broadcasting towers. Professor Hallberg, 2002 to 2007, he looked at regional skin cancer rates and he found, oh, that's interesting, that they were higher when there was a higher density of broadcasting towers. Finally, some studies have found problems in cows, bless them. So, for example, there was a study around a big broadcasting tower in mainland Europe, and it found that the cows in the nearby fields had reduced melatonin. How interesting. That is the substance in our body that helps to regulate our sleep-wake cycle. And it's also an important, absolutely vital overnight antioxidant. And this is very interesting because there are lots of studies on melatonin and breast cancer. Breast cancer patients very often have low melatonin for their age. Night shift workers have reduced overnight melatonin and are more prone to breast cancer. So there are overlaps here. Another thing I thought was, well, wait a moment, we've used microwave ovens, and surely these weak pulsing microwaves are okay because they don't cook us. They don't cook us. Well, that is part of the cultural problem, because the safety standards that exist around the world today are based largely on the levels that cook things, on the levels that heat tissue. And this is a problem because since the Cold War, research has been building up showing biological effects at much lower levels. In other words, non-heating levels, sometimes 10 times, 100 times, even 10,000 times lower biological biological effects have been found. This is a picture of a mass of DNA, little fragments of streaming from it as it's being irradiated by, I think it's 3G, one of the signals from phone-masts. So just to make that a bit more specific, according to Professor Henry Lay, who's one of the most distinguished scholars in this field, and who has done research on microwaves and health, since 2007, on top of papers that have been written before, there have been over 90 studies showing free radical damage to tissue or cells, and there's about 74 now since 2007, showing genotoxic effects. That's things like changes in the way our genes express, or increased DNA strand breaks. DNA strands do break and we repair them, but it's an increased breakage rate and a reduced rate of repair. So it's not good. So what I hear from this is that this wireless radiation is having a hidden biological pressure upon us. It's a kind of hidden stress. Some of the precautionary scientists, notably Dr Myron Ho, a British geneticist, are saying, well, in that case, we really ought to compare this to passive smoking. So Dr Myron Ho has said, let's compare Wi-Fi to passive smoking, and really it ought to be banned in public spaces. Well, we don't hear this, do we, when we install our routers, and that's part of the problem.